Olá, seja bem-vindo ao nosso canal Direito Sem Formalidades. Meu nome é Marcos, eu sou professor titular da Faculdade de Direito da Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora. O vídeo que a gente vai apresentar hoje tem um formato um pouco diferente do que a gente apresenta normalmente aqui no nosso canal, porque se trata de uma apresentação de um trabalho realizado no encontro da Associação Direito e Sociedade, Law and Society, nos Estados Unidos, em Chicago. Esse trabalho de pesquisa foi realizado por mim, pelo 𝐁𝐢𝐨𝐝𝐢𝐯 e pela Suzana van der Ploeg. Todos dois são mestres em Direito e Inovação pela Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora e são doutorandos em Direito pela Universidade do Estado do Rio de Janeiro. A ideia desse trabalho é justamente expor as questões relacionadas ao acesso aos recursos genéticos naturais associados a conhecimento tradicional que são registrados no sistema eletrônico do 𝐒𝐻𝐤. Então a gente fez uma coleta de dados e a gente está fazendo essa apresentação para verificar se de fato quem é que está acessando esse conhecimento tradicional, quem é que está acessando esses recursos genéticos naturais, como está acessando, o que isso significa do ponto de vista da proteção do conhecimento tradicional e do ponto de vista do acesso aos recursos genéticos naturais da biodiversidade brasileira. É importante a gente dizer que esse é um projeto financiado pela 𝐵𝐵𝐺, pelo CNPq e pelo MCTI. Graças a esses financiamentos a gente pode realizar essa pesquisa. Então a gente deixa aqui desde já o nosso agradecimento. E eu espero que você tenha uma ótima experiência assistindo a esse nosso vídeo. My name is Marcos. I'm a professor at the Universidade Federal de Juiz de Fora, and 𝐁𝐢𝐈 is my co-author. 𝐒𝐻𝐈 is a PhD student in State University in Rio de Janeiro. And Suzana is also a PhD student, but she's not here today. So first of all, our paper is on biodiversity and sustainability, access to natural genetic resources and traditional knowledge. We would like to acknowledge the financial support from different agencies in Brazil, like 𝐵𝐵𝐺, CNPq, and MCTI. So first of all, I'd like to make a brief introduction about our paper, our research. This is part of a long-term research. We are trying to understand how the piece of legislation in Brazil in general, pieces of legislation in Brazil, they are dealing with the protection of traditional knowledge, intellectual property rights, and of course, the natural genetic resources, how they are being appropriated by multinational companies and how this traditional knowledge is not being respected and protected, and all this traditional knowledge is taken for granted. It's kind of a deep analysis of biopiracy now through new colors, I would say so. So this is part of a social legal study because we are trying to analyze the Brazilian legislation on biological resources and traditional knowledge protection. Our theoretical framework here is based on Boaventura de Souza Santos, the epistemology of the self and the sociology of absence. And we are trying to understand how these natural genetic resources are being accessed and how they are being shipped to other countries, and if the legislation is in fact being respected, and how this piece of legislation is being used in order to satisfy the business interests in this case. So first of all, the Brazilian context. Here Brazil is an archetypal southern country with an extensive biodiversity and profound ecology of traditional knowledge. That's why we're going to use Boaventura de Souza Santos' perspective, because we are trying to analyze, using grounded theory, all this empirical data we are going to collect from the Ministry of Environment. So we are based on these three pieces of legislation here: the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is responsible for the protection of the environmental conservation, and also the equitable sharing of benefits with traditional people in Brazil. The Brazilian legislation governing access to biological resources and associated traditional knowledge is a new piece of legislation if we consider that before that we had a more kind of a provisional measure which intended to be more strict in the protection and the access of natural genetic resources. And the decree, which is trying to regulate and implement this Act number 1300-123. We are going to study the 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐬𝐬, which is an electronic system implemented by the Ministry of the Environment for managing access to biological resources and associated traditional knowledge, including access to and shipment of biological resources. So the objective of our research, of this specific research, is to ascertain whether there is evidence of misappropriation of traditional knowledge through the Brazilian Ministry of Environment's database on access to biological genetic resources of biodiversity. So the idea here is to analyze the Brazilian legal acts protecting biological resources and traditional knowledge, and we are going to investigate the evidence of misappropriation through the 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐬𝐬 database. Is that most of the people who are trying to access these natural genetic resources, they are going to use this electronic system. You just have to declare that you have accessed that or that genetic resource, and then you can access, and once you've accessed the genetic resource, you can just ship that to another country. And then we are going to evaluate current legislation, if in fact this current legislation is deterring biopiracy and ensuring equitable benefit distribution. Basically, our theoretical framework, I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I want to show you the data, but I just want to tell you that most of the idea here was to justify the importance of this specific research, because we are going to use the idea of Boaventura de Souza Santos, that most of the legislation we have in Brazil, in southern countries in general, they are going to be used in the benefit of northern countries. We understand that most of this idea of protection of biocultural heritage and biocultural rights, they can be easily manipulated in favor of multinational companies and to the detriment of traditional people. And the idea that we are dealing with this invisibility and this abyssal thinking, which is the idea that we can easily manipulate the legislation in favor of the powerful ones with the economic power. We collected 12,924 shipment registration via Access to Information Act. We couldn't get specific information, so we had to use the Access to Information Act, and we requested this data to the Brazilian Ministry of Environment. And the empirical legal research here, we are going to see what kind of inferences we can use and we can extract from this data. Well, the legal framework for international shipments, of course, we have the Basic Act, which is the Brazilian biodiversity legislation, and how this transfer of organisms containing biological genetic resources to institutions outside the country, including the transfer of responsibility, which means that we are going to see if in fact this responsibility transfer is being executed in accordance with the legislation, in accordance with all the regulations. And then, of course, this material transfer agreement, if there are any formalized agreements, including share of benefits, accountability mechanisms, and of course, the monitoring responsibility. If in fact the 𝐒𝐮𝐬𝐬𝐬, which is responsible for the monitoring access activities and shipments of the samples. Now I'm going to pass to 𝐁𝐢𝐤𝐴.
I'm going to talk briefly about the data. Here we have the data analysis from all the 12,924 registrations. First of all, we have in all of these registrations, only 191 were declared as related to traditional or Creole varieties, and 53 did not provide this information. All the other registrations were declared as not containing traditional or Creole varieties in the shipment. This graphic here shows the the distribution by the years since the implementation in 2017 until 2024, when we updated the data, and we had a very increase in the registrations, with exception during the COVID-19 pandemic. Most samples came from the Atlantic forest, collected both in nature and from institutional collections. Also, the Amazon forest was only the third most recurrent place of origin of the shipments. And here we can see that most of the data came from, most of the resources came from fauna and flora, followed by fungi, microorganisms, and viruses. During the analysis, we categorized the agents by three different types: companies, research institutions, and individuals. Among the registrations that declared the involvement of traditional and Creole varieties, 168 were from companies, most of them from Bayer, and the other came from public universities and individuals. The ones that declared as non-traditional resources were led by research institutions, and they were more than 12,000 registrations. We also categorized the shipments by the country where they were sent, and most of them came to the USA, followed by France, UK, and Germany. We also analyzed the user motivations and application sectors. Half of them was simply responded as scientific research, so they were very vague and were not able to analyze how this could be monitored by the 𝐒𝐻𝐈 later on.
So to be very, very objective now, for the wrapping up of all this data, we've tried to construct the theory based on what we could extract from the data. First of all, we understand that there is legal ambiguity, which means that freer, prior, informed consent for access is just not put into practice. There is a policy shift, of course, the prior authorization with electronic registration, which means beforehand it was necessary to have a prior authorization, formal one, and now just an electronic registration, which facilitates the access, and there's more laxity. And low registration of traditional varieties, it indicates this omission, this underreporting, and limited ability to identify traditional knowledge association. Now, the institutional weakness, which is that 𝐒𝐻𝐈 is not effectively enough to control the shipments and the access to traditional knowledge. And of course, here I've already said, but this knowledge oversight, it's easy to understand that nowadays that most of the genetic resource, when you have scientists or multinational companies neglecting traditional knowledge recognition, and because of that, it's really hard to say that natural genetic resource is in fact just a natural genetic resource isolated from all the traditional knowledge. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. So, thank you very much.
Bom, pessoal, espero que vocês tenham gostado dessa nossa apresentação no 𝐻𝐢𝐸 Society e espero que vocês tenham tirado aqui boas lições. Se você tiver mais interesses em mais vídeos sobre essa nossa pesquisa, não deixe de acessar outros vídeos que já estão aqui no nosso canal e acompanhe. Lembre-se de se inscrever, dar seu like e seguir o nosso canal para mais conhecimentos desse tipo. Obrigado e até a próxima!